He built the house before he had a wife. Nailed every board himself, hauled every stone, mixed every batch of mortar under a Kansas sun that didn't care whether a man lived or died out there on the open prairie. And when the walls were up and the floor was laid, before the roof was even finished, Wyatt Granger dragged 2 chairs onto that unfinished porch and set them side by side. One for him. One for a woman he had never met, never spoken to, never even seen. His neighbors thought he had lost his mind. Maybe he had. But that empty chair would change everything. If this story moves you, stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The prairie in late October had a way of making a man feel very small. Wyatt Granger had learned that in his first year out here, when the wind came down flat and hard from the north and hit the unbroken grassland with nothing to slow it, no trees worth mentioning, no hills, just mile after mile of brown and gold stretching out until it blurred into sky. On those days, the world felt less like a place to live and more like a warning, like the land itself was daring you to stay. He stayed. He was 31 years old in the autumn of 1879, a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands and a jaw that had been described on more than one occasion as stubborn-looking even when he was in a perfectly agreeable mood. He had come to Rook County, Kansas, 4 years earlier with a government land claim, a mule named Chester who had since died of old age, and just enough cash money to buy seed, tools, and one winter's worth of provisions. No family, no partner. Just himself and the idea that land could be made into something if a person was willing to work hard enough and long enough and bleed enough to earn it. He had bled plenty. The first winter nearly finished him. Not from cold. He had built a half-dugout shelter before the first frost, roofed it with sod, and burned buffalo chips for heat like every other hard-headed homesteader out on the plains. What almost finished him was the silence. Not the absence of sound exactly, because the prairie was never truly quiet. The wind was always doing something. Cattle from the neighboring claim lowed in the dark. Coyotes had opinions they shared nightly. But there was a particular kind of silence that lived inside the 4 walls of that dugout, a silence that had weight to it, and it pressed down on a man in a way that the cold never could. He got through it by working, by planning, by writing lists of things he intended to build and then building them, one by one, as the seasons turned. A proper well, a barn, a chicken coop that actually kept the chickens in, fences along the east and west property lines, a root cellar dug 4 feet into the hillside, a small smokehouse, and finally, by the summer of 1879, a proper house. Frame construction, not sod, with a real floor and real windows and a porch that faced south so a person could sit out in the evening and watch the light change over the grassland without the wind cutting straight through them. He finished the porch on a Saturday morning in early September. He was standing in the doorway of the nearly complete house, still no roof on the porch overhang, just open sky above the decking, when he looked at that empty stretch of planks and felt something he hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not pride. Something more like an ache. The kind that doesn't have a clean name. He went to the barn and found 2 chairs he had made the previous winter, rough-cut pine with seats he had sanded down as smooth as he could manage. He had made them with some vague idea that he might want to sit outside on warm evenings. He carried both chairs out to the porch and set them side by side, facing the prairie. He sat in one. The other one sat empty. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went inside and found a piece of paper and a pencil stub. The nearest town of any size was Caldwell, roughly 14 miles to the southeast. Wyatt rode in every 2 or 3 weeks to pick up supplies and mail, and on a Tuesday morning in the second week of October, he walked into the office of the Caldwell Commercial and asked to place an advertisement in the paper. Harlan Pruitt, who ran the commercial from a cramped back office that smelled permanently of ink and tobacco, peered at the piece of paper Wyatt slid across the counter and read it twice. "Huh," Pruitt said. "It's clear enough, isn't it?" "It's clear." Pruitt read it a third time. "Most fellows just say they want a wife. Good health, good character, willing to work hard. You know, the usual." "I'm not most fellows." Pruitt looked up over his glasses. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, with ink-stained fingers and the mildly skeptical expression of someone who had read too many things written by too many people to be surprised by much anymore. "No," he said, "I can see that." The advertisement read, "Homesteader, 31, Rook County, Kansas. 4 years on the land. House built, barn built. Root cellar, well, 160 acres under claim. Not looking for a housekeeper or a decoration. Looking for a partner, sir. Someone who thinks for herself, says what she means, and isn't afraid of hard work or hard weather. I've built the house. I've built one chair for myself and one for someone I haven't met yet. If you believe a life can be worth building with someone you don't know yet, write to me. Tell me something true. W. Granger, General Delivery, Caldwell, Kansas. Pruitt set the paper down. You want me to run this word for word? Word for word. You know, most women answering ads like this are looking for security. You're asking them to prove something to you before you'll even... I know what I'm asking, Wyatt said. Pruitt shrugged. He had seen plenty of lonely men come through this office over the years. Most of them were writing advertisements for brides the same way they might write an order for farm equipment, listing specifications and expected performance. This one was different. He wasn't sure if that meant the man was smarter than average, or considerably less so. Your nickel, Pruitt said, and took the paper. The reaction from Wyatt's neighbors was about what he expected. His closest neighbor, a broad, red-faced man named Dolph Castle, who ran cattle on the claim to the east, heard about the advertisement within a week. News traveled fast in a place where entertainment was scarce, and rode over one afternoon while Wyatt was patching a section of fence near the property line. Heard you put an ad in the commercial, Castle said from horseback. Yep. Heard it was a little unusual. Depends on your definition. Castle squinted down at him. He had 3 grown daughters and a wife who had come out from Ohio 15 years ago and hadn't smiled in public since. He was not a cruel man, but he had the particular habit of frontier men who had seen too many grand plans collapse into dirt. He reflexively distrusted anything that sounded hopeful. You put something in there about a chair. I did. A chair for a woman you never met. That's right. Castle worked his jaw like he was chewing something difficult. Wyatt, you know how many men out here have sent for brides and gotten themselves a world of trouble? Harmon Purcell over on the Cimarron put an ad in 4 different papers, got a woman out here from Tennessee, and she was back on a train east inside of 6 weeks. I know about Harmon. Then you know it don't always work the way a man pictures it. Wyatt straightened up from the fence post and looked at Castle directly. I'm not picturing her a certain way. That's the whole point. Castle stared at him for a moment, decided this was not a conversation he was going to win, touched his hat brim, and rode away. Word spread anyway. By November, 2 families at the church in Caldwell. Wyatt attended irregularly, mostly to stay on polite terms with his community, had heard about the advertisement and the chairs, and the general opinion seemed to be somewhere between bemused and gently concerned for his mental health. Mrs. Dorothea Fenwick, who ran the dry goods counter at Caldwell's main supply store and had opinions about everything, said within earshot of Wyatt while he was buying flour, "That poor man, sitting out there talking to an empty chair like it's going to write him back." Wyatt bought his flour, said good morning to Mrs. Fenwick, and rode home. He was not offended. He had grown up in a family where people said practical things and meant them, and he understood that what his neighbors were expressing in their particular unvarnished way was a kind of concern. They had seen men come apart out here, from isolation, from failed crops, from winters that went on past any reasonable length. A man who built chairs for imaginary wives was, from a certain angle, a man who might be starting to lose his grip. He didn't think he was losing his grip. He thought he was just being precise about what he wanted. The first letter arrived in late November. He almost missed it. Pruitt had it set aside behind the counter at the commercial office rather than at the general delivery window because, as Pruitt explained with a trace of amusement, I wanted to make sure it actually got to you and didn't end up under a boot heel. It was a single sheet of paper written in a neat, small hand with a Philadelphia postmark. Wyatt read it standing at the counter. Mr. Granger, I'm going to tell you something true, since that is what you asked for. I am 27 years old. I work at a printing press in Philadelphia, not setting type, but operating the press itself, which most people consider unsuitable work for a woman, and which I consider nobody's business but mine. I am not beautiful in any exceptional way, and I would rather you not imagine otherwise. I am not fragile, and I am not romantic in the way that word usually gets applied to women of my age. I have read your advertisement 3 times, and the reason I am writing is not the chair, although the chair was the thing that made me read it a 3rd time. The reason I am writing is the word partner. You used it where most men would use wife. Those are not the same word. I don't know if I want to move to Kansas. I don't know anything about you beyond what you wrote. But I think there might be something worth knowing, and I am honest enough to tell you I'm curious. My name is Vivian Mercer. I live at 14 Callowhill Street, Philadelphia. If you write back, tell me something true in return. V. Mercer. Wyatt read it twice more. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his coat pocket, thanked Pruitt, and rode home in a cold wind that he barely noticed. But He wrote back that same evening, at the kitchen table, by the light of an oil lamp. He was not a naturally expressive man. He had always found writing harder than working with his hands. The words felt clumsy to him in a way that a hammer or a fence post never did. But he had read her letter again, and he understood something about the way she wrote. She had stripped everything decorative away, left only the essential things, and expected the same in return. That he could do. Miss Mercer, something true. I have been out here 4 years, and the hardest part of it has not been the weather or the work or the years when the crops failed. The hardest part is that there is nobody to think alongside. I can do this alone. I've proved that. But I'm not sure what the point of proving it is. Something else true. I am not a patient man by nature. I have been patient about this because I decided it mattered enough to be patient about. That is different from actually being patient. The chair is still there. I am not writing to you because of sentiment. I am writing because your letter was the first piece of mail I've received in 4 years that required me to think before I answered it. W. Granger. He mailed it the next week when he went to Caldwell for supplies. Then he went home and did not think about it obsessively, which was what he told himself, and did think about it nearly constantly, which was the truth. Her second letter came 3 weeks later. This one was longer. She told him about Philadelphia in a way that made him feel the weight of the city, the noise, the press of people, the particular exhaustion of living somewhere that never went quiet. She described her work at the printing press with a kind of straightforward pride that he recognized, because it was the same feeling he had about his fences and his well. She told him about her father, a quiet man who had operated a small typesetting shop until his hands had started to tremble too badly to set type, and about her mother who had died when Vivian was 19, and about the particular way a city could make you feel invisible even when you were standing in the middle of a crowd. I keep thinking about your description of the silence, she wrote. You said it had weight to it. I know what you mean, but for me the noise is the same thing. It presses down in the same way. I think what you and I are both describing is loneliness. The location doesn't change the weight of it. He read that line 4 or 5 times. He wrote back within a week. Faster than he usually managed, because he had things he wanted to say before they slipped away from him. Through November and December and into the new year, the letters went back and forth with a regularity that Pruitt at the commercial began to note with visible amusement. Your correspondence seems to be thriving, Pruitt said in January, handing over a letter with a Philadelphia postmark. Much obliged, Wyatt said, and left before Pruitt could say anything else. He had told nobody about the letters. Not Castle, not anyone at the church, not the Dempsey family 2 miles north who occasionally invited him for Sunday dinner and had a daughter of marriageable age that Mrs. Dempsey occasionally mentioned with the subtlety of a thrown stone. He kept it to himself not from secrecy exactly, but because it felt like something that could be easily damaged by other people's opinions, and he was not ready to let that happen. What he and Vivian were building in those letters was not romance. He would not have used that word, and neither would she. He was fairly certain of that. It was something more like architecture. They were describing themselves to each other with unusual precision, laying out the actual structure of who they were rather than a pleasing false front. She told him about her stubbornness and her tendency to argue with people she disagreed with even when it would have been easier to stay quiet. He told her about his temper, not violent, but sharp, the kind that could go cold and silent when he was genuinely angry in a way that people sometimes found harder to deal with than shouting. She told him she had once been engaged and had ended it herself, 6 months before the wedding, because she had realized she was marrying a version of herself that the man wanted her to be rather than the version she actually was. He told her he had come close to leaving Kansas in his 2nd year, had actually packed a bag and gotten as far as Caldwell before turning back, because he realized he was leaving out of loneliness rather than good sense, and he didn't trust decisions made from that particular place. They were, in these letters, more honest with each other than either of them had been with most people they had known face to face. By March, Vivian had written in one letter, almost as an aside, I'm starting to think this might be something real. I don't know what to do with that exactly. I thought I should tell you. He had read that sentence while sitting at his kitchen table in a late winter that had been particularly grinding, with a cracked rib from a fence-building accident that hadn't healed right, and a stretch of weeks where the wind had blown cold and mean without stopping, and he had felt something shift inside his chest that had nothing to do with the rib. He wrote back, "I think it is something real. I thought you should know I'm not writing to anyone else." She wrote back, "Neither am I." Spring came late that year and came grudgingly, the way Kansas spring sometimes did, not arriving so much as gradually pushing winter out by sheer persistence. By April, the grass was coming back pale and determined, and Wyatt was putting in the year's wheat under skies that couldn't make up their mind between rain and sun. He was also, for the first time in 4 years on this land, thinking about the house differently. Not as a structure he lived in, but as a place where someone else might also live. He noticed things he hadn't noticed before. The way the morning light came through the east window of the kitchen and landed on the floor in a way that was actually quite decent. The way the spare bedroom, which he had been using for storage, had good proportions. The way the porch faced south and caught the late afternoon sun. He had told Vivian about the house in his letters. She had asked questions about it, practical questions, which he appreciated. How deep was the well? What was the root cellar like? How far to the nearest town, and what was in that town? She was not asking out of romance. She was asking the way someone asks when they are trying to understand whether a thing could actually work. In a letter in late April, she wrote, "I have been trying to imagine it, not romantically. I know you'd find that irritating, and honestly, so would I. I mean, actually imagine it. The distance from the house to the barn, the sound it makes at night, whether a person could stand the flatness of it. I can't quite get there in my head, but I find myself trying, which I think is significant." He wrote back, "It takes a while to see what the flatness gives you instead of what it takes away. What it gives you is the sky. You can see weather coming from 50 miles out. You can see the light change in ways that don't happen where there are hills or buildings in the way. I'm not saying it's beautiful. I'm saying it's honest. It doesn't hide anything." She wrote, "That might be the most precise description of landscape I have ever read from a man who claims not to be good with words." He read that, and alone at his kitchen table, with no one to see him, smiled. It was in June, a dry summer beginning to bake the ground, that Vivian wrote the letter that changed the tenor of everything. She had been moving towards something in the previous several letters. He could feel it the way you feel weather on the horizon before you can name what it is. And in this letter, she finally said it directly. "I think I want to come. I think I want to take what we've been building in these letters and find out if it holds up in the actual world. I know that's terrifying. It's terrifying to me too. I don't believe in doing things because they're safe, and I don't believe in waiting until all the uncertainty is gone before making a decision, because the uncertainty never goes all the way. But I wanted to tell you before I decided anything, because it affects you as much as it affects me." He put the letter down on the table and looked at the wall of his kitchen for a long time. Then he picked it up and read it again, slowly. He wrote back the next morning before he went out to tend the cattle. "Come. Not because I'm telling you to, and not because you should feel obligated to whatever you think we've built here. Come because you want to find out if it's real. I want to find out too. The chair is still where I put it." He mailed it on his next trip to Caldwell. He came home, went back to work, and tried very hard not to count the days. The summer had begun to tip toward August when the letter arrived. He recognized her handwriting on the envelope from 20 feet away, from the angle he was crossing the street toward the general delivery window. He had gotten good at recognizing it. He took the letter, put it in his pocket, made himself get back on his horse, and ride the 2 miles out of town before he opened it. He stopped under the only decent tree along that stretch of road, a cottonwood that leaned east from years of northwest wind, and opened the envelope. The letter was short, the shortest she had ever written him. "Wyatt, my father had a stroke 4 days ago. He is alive but cannot walk without help, cannot manage the business alone. I cannot leave him. I don't know what to do. I don't know what this means for us. I don't know if there is an us without me coming west, and I don't know if I can come west, and I don't know how long any of this will last or what will be left of whatever we have by the time I find out. I'm sorry. That's not enough, but it's all I have right now. Vivian." He read it twice. He folded it along its original creases and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope in his shirt pocket, close against his chest. The cottonwood made its dry, papery sound in the wind. Somewhere out on the grass, a meadowlark was saying the same 4 notes over and over. Wyatt sat on his horse for a while under that leaning tree and looked at the prairie and thought about what a man was supposed to do with news like this. Then he turned his horse toward home. He had work to finish before dark. He would write to her tonight. The chair could wait. He wrote to her that same night. Not the letter he wanted to write, which would have been long and probably said too much, but the letter she needed, which was shorter and said the things that actually mattered. Vivian, don't apologize. You did nothing wrong and you have nothing to be sorry for. Your father is sick and you're staying. That's not a failing. That's who you are, and it's part of why I've been writing to you for 8 months. I'm not going anywhere. The chair isn't going anywhere either. Take the time you need. I'll be here. Wyatt. He sealed it and left it on the table to mail in the morning, then went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours staring at the ceiling. He was not going to pretend, even to himself, that the news hadn't landed hard. He was 31 years old, and he had been patient about a great many things in his life, and patience was something he had developed out of necessity rather than temperament. His natural inclination was to move toward a thing once he had decided he wanted it. Standing still went against the grain of him in a way that was almost physical, like trying to hold a door shut against wind. But he had written what he'd written, and he meant it, and he was going to have to find a way to live inside the waiting without letting it hollow him out. He got up before first light the next morning and went to work. August turned to September. September became October, and the grassland went back to its autumn colors, brown and pale gold, the same as the year before and the year before that. Wyatt put up the wheat he'd grown, repaired the south fence line that a late summer storm had knocked crooked in 2 places, and started cutting and stacking wood for winter with the focused, slightly grim energy of a man who is keeping himself busy on purpose. Vivian's letters still came, though less frequently now. She was exhausted. That came through in every paragraph, in the compressed quality of her sentences, in the way she sometimes started a thought and then abandoned it mid-page as though she had simply run out of fuel. Her father, Edmund Mercer, had survived the stroke but was left with a dragging left foot and a hand that shook when he tried to use it, and the typesetting shop he had run for 20 years was now her responsibility. She had never run a business before. She was learning as she went. I made 3 mistakes this week that cost us money we don't have, she wrote in a letter that arrived in late September. I miscalculated a job estimate and undercharged a customer by almost half. I should have checked the numbers twice, and I didn't because I was tired, and tired is not an excuse. I'm getting better at this, but getting better is a slow and expensive process. He wrote back, everyone who ever learned to do anything hard made expensive mistakes while learning. The question is whether you quit or you keep going. From what I know of you, the answer is obvious. She wrote back, that might be the most practical compliment anyone has ever given me. I'm choosing to take it as one. He was glad she couldn't see him smile. The winter of 1880 was bad, not catastrophic. He'd seen worse, or heard of worse from men who'd been out here longer, but it was the kind of sustained cold that settled in before Thanksgiving and didn't ease until nearly April, with a stretch in January where the temperature dropped far enough that the water in the bucket he kept by the stove froze before morning, even if he banked the fire well. He lost 2 calves to the cold and a section of roof on the chicken coop that he had to patch in weather that made the work genuinely unpleasant. He also lost the better part of 3 days to what he first told himself was a cold, and what turned out to be a fever that put him flat on his back when he could least afford to be flat on his back. Castle's wife, a practical woman named Marta, who had apparently decided that no man should die of stubbornness within her reach, came over after Castle noticed no smoke from Wyatt's chimney for half a day, and brought soup and the kind of brusque, impersonal care that he was grateful for precisely because it didn't require him to be gracious about it. You need somebody in this house, Marta Castle said flatly, setting a pot on the stove. She was a square-built German woman with gray-streaked hair and the permanently weathered expression of someone who had been practical about hard things for a very long time. Man living alone gets sick out here. He can die before anyone notices. I noticed, Wyatt said from under the blankets. You couldn't get up. I was going to get up. Marta gave him the look she probably gave her children when they said something she found unconvincing. There was a woman, wasn't there? I heard from Dolph you had some correspondence going. Wyatt looked at the ceiling. She's not coming? She's coming, he said. It's just taking longer than expected. Marta was quiet for a moment, stirring the soup. How much longer? I don't know. She didn't say anything to that. She left the soup and came back the next day to check on him, and the day after that, and didn't mention Vivian again. He appreciated that too. He did not tell Vivian about the fever. He told himself this was because she had enough to worry about, which was true, But there was also a part of him that didn't want her to picture him laid low. It was a vanity he recognized and didn't particularly respect in himself. But there it was. What he did tell her, in a letter he wrote in February while the cold pressed hard against the walls of the house, and the wind made sounds in the eaves that he had stopped finding unsettling only after the first 2 years, was something he hadn't planned to say. I want to be honest with you about something. This waiting is harder than I expected it to be. Not because I'm angry about it, or because I blame you. I don't, not for a second. But I want you to know that I'm not just sitting here undisturbed, going about my business, perfectly content to let the years go by. I'm not built that way, and you'd see through it if I pretended otherwise. What I'm doing is choosing to wait, which is different from waiting easily. I wanted you to know the difference. He almost didn't send it. Reread it twice, decided it was too much, set it aside, came back to it 2 days later and decided it was exactly right. Sent it. Her reply came 3 weeks later. Wyatt, thank you for telling me that. I've been worried that you were too patient, that I was allowing myself the comfort of believing you'd wait forever, because it was easier than facing what I might be asking of you. Knowing it costs you something makes it feel more real, more honest. I don't want you to pretend to be better than you are. I've been working very hard not to pretend to be better than I am. My father is improving slowly. He walked to the kitchen table under his own power yesterday for the first time since the stroke. He cried when he sat down. I turned away so he wouldn't see me. He read that last sentence and sat with it for a long time. Spring came again. Then summer. Then another autumn, the grass going gold for the second time since her father's stroke. More than a year had passed. The community of Wyatt's neighborhood had developed a collective opinion about his situation, and that opinion had traveled through the usual channels. Church on Sundays, the supply store in Caldwell, the occasional gathering at one homestead or another when the weather was good enough and the work light enough to allow socializing. The opinion was broadly that Wyatt Granger was being a fool. It was not stated cruelly. Most of the people who held this view considered themselves to be reasonable, well-meaning individuals who were simply being realistic about the way the world worked. A woman who had been corresponding with a man for over a year and still hadn't boarded a train was, by this reading of the situation, a woman who was never going to board a train. Either she had found reasons to stay that had nothing to do with her father, or she had changed her mind and lacked the nerve to say so, or, and this version circulated particularly freely, the whole correspondence had been somewhat one-sided in its seriousness from the start. Wyatt heard versions of this opinion from several directions. I don't mean anything by it, said Tom Dempsey, who ran the neighboring claim to the north and had the decency to say it to Wyatt's face rather than behind his back. They were mending a shared fence line on a cool October morning, both of them working in jackets, the sky the washed-out blue it got in autumn. But Margaret and I were talking, and we both think, it's been a long time, Wyatt. There are women closer to hand, women who've been here, who know what this life is. Wyatt drove a staple into the fence post with 3 measured strikes of the hammer. I appreciate that, Tom. The Calloway girl in Caldwell, I know who she is. She's a good woman. I'm sure she is. Dempsey stopped working and looked at him. He was a decent man, Tom Dempsey, with a round face that was habitually sunburned and a fundamental inability to leave a thing alone once he had decided it needed saying. You're not going to consider it? No. Because of letters. Wyatt looked at him evenly. Because of what's in the letters. There's a difference. Dempsey didn't have an answer for that. He went back to the fence and they finished the work without talking much, and parted on perfectly civil terms. But Wyatt rode home with the conversation sitting in him in a way that took a while to settle. The problem was not that Dempsey was unreasonable. The problem was that, from a certain angle, the angle of pure practicality, the angle of a man who had watched enough frontier optimism turn to dust to develop a reflex skepticism about anything that required faith to sustain, Tom Dempsey was making perfect sense. Wyatt understood that angle. He had lived inside that angle for most of his adult life. What he had trouble explaining, even to himself, was why this particular thing had moved him out of it. He was splitting wood behind the barn in late October, a clear, cold afternoon, the kind that made the axe feel good in the hands, when Castle rode up and leaned on the fence rail with the expression of a man who has decided to say something he has been holding for a while. Agnes Pryor's daughter is moving back from Wichita, Castle said. Husband died. She's got 2 little ones, but she's solid. Knows how to work. Wyatt split a log. Dolph, I'm just telling you what I know. You're telling me to give up. Castle's jaw worked. He was not a comfortable man in conversations that required precision, but he was trying. I'm telling you that a year and a half is a long time. That's all I'm saying. A lot of men would have moved on. I'm not a lot of men. That's been clear from the start. Kessel's voice had something in it that wasn't quite exasperation. Something closer to genuine worry, which was its own kind of irritating. But there's a point where holding on to something stops being faithfulness and starts being what? Kessel looked at him steadily. Stubbornness. Just plain stubbornness dressed up to look like something more. Wyatt set the axe down and looked at Castle for a moment. The late afternoon light was coming in flat and golden from the southwest, the way it did in October, and it lit up the dead grass beyond the fence and made it look almost warm. Maybe it is, he said, but I know the difference between giving up because it's the right thing and giving up because it's the easier thing, and I'm not there yet. Castle looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once, the way men nod when they don't agree but have decided to respect the answer. He tipped his hat and rode back toward his own land. Wyatt picked up the axe and went back to the wood. The letter that arrived in November was different from the others. He knew it before he opened it. There was something in the weight of the envelope, the density of it. It was thicker than her usual letters. He made himself wait until he was home, and the horse was seen to, and there was a fire going in the kitchen stove before he sat down at the table and opened it. She had written 8 pages, the longest letter she had ever sent him. She told him about the past 6 months in a way she hadn't done in the letters while they were happening, retrospectively, with the clarity that comes when you've survived something far enough to look back at it. She described the slow, grinding work of running the shop, the employees who had tested her authority in the early months and eventually stopped, the accounts she had restructured, the single large contract she had gone after and won that had stabilized their finances for the first time since her father's stroke. She described her father's recovery with the same unsentimental precision she brought to everything, the things he could do now that he couldn't do 6 months ago, the things he would likely never fully recover. The conversation they had finally had 2 weeks ago, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, where he had asked her directly what she was waiting for. He said, "That man in Kansas is still waiting for you." I said, "I know." He said, "And you're still waiting for me to not need you." I didn't answer that because it was true, and he knew it was true, and there wasn't much to add. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "Vivian, I am better. I am not all the way better, and I may never be all the way better, but I can get to the kitchen table by myself, and I can manage a spoon, and I am not going to fall over and die because you board a train." I said, "That's not what I'm afraid of." He said, "What are you afraid of?" And I couldn't answer that either. Wyatt set the pages down on the table. He picked them up and read on. I've been asking myself that question for 2 weeks. What am I afraid of? The honest answer, and I promised you honesty from the first letter, is this. I'm afraid that the person you've been writing to for 18 months and the person who will step off that train are not the same person. I'm afraid that what we've built in letters, which is real, I believe it's real, might not survive contact with reality, with the actual texture of days, with me being tired and short-tempered and you being whatever you are when things go wrong. I'm afraid that the chair is a beautiful idea, and that beautiful ideas don't always hold up. But I am more afraid of never finding out. I have been training a young man named Arthur to manage the shop. He started 2 months ago. He is diligent and reasonably competent, and my father likes him, which matters. In another 2 months, perhaps 3, I believe he will be able to manage without me watching over his shoulder every day. I am telling you this so you know I am moving towards something, not just away from something. I'm not sure of the date yet. I'll tell you when I know. Vivian. He read the last page twice. Then he got up, went to the window, and stood there looking out at the dark prairie for a long time. The wind had come up while he was reading, the kind of steady northwest wind that meant the temperature would drop overnight. He could hear it moving through the dead grass. He thought about what she had written, the fear about the chair being a beautiful idea. He had his own version of that fear if he was being truthful with himself. Not fear that she wouldn't be what he hoped, but fear that the life he was offering wasn't enough. That what looked like honest simplicity from a distance might just look like hardship up close. That the prairie, which he had come to understand and even love in his grim, reluctant way, might only look like loneliness to someone who hadn't chosen it yet. He went back to the table and picked up his pencil. He wrote, "Vivian, the chair is still there. I haven't moved it. It's been out on that porch through 2 winters and 1 hailstorm, and I've looked at it more times than I can count. I won't pretend that it's just furniture to me. You've known me too long to believe I'd pretend that. You asked what you're afraid of. I'll tell you what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid you'll come all this way and find out that the life I have to offer is smaller than what you gave up. I'm afraid that what I can give you is decent and honest and real, but not enough. That's been in me a long time, and I've never written it down because I wasn't sure it was useful to say. I'm saying it now because you said something honest, and it deserved an honest answer. Come when you can come. I'll be here. Wyatt. He sealed the envelope and set it on the table to mail in the morning. Outside, the wind worked steadily against the walls of the house. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Somewhere far out on the prairie, past where any light reached, the grass moved in long waves that no one was awake to see. He sat at the table for a while longer. Then he banked the fire and went to bed. Her reply to his letter came faster than usual. 2 weeks instead of 3, which told him something about the state she was in when she wrote it. Not frantic, but moving. The handwriting was the same neat, compressed script he had learned to read the way some men read weather, looking past the surface for what was underneath. You wrote that you're afraid the life you're offering is smaller than what I'm giving up. I've been thinking about that for 10 days, and I want to answer it carefully, because it deserves a careful answer. What I'm giving up, a city that makes me invisible. Work I'm good at but didn't choose. A life that was shaped mostly by other people's needs and other people's expectations, and one near mistake of a marriage that I got out of just in time. I'm not giving up something golden, Wyatt. I'm giving up something familiar. Those are not the same thing. What you're offering, I don't know yet. That's honest. But decent and honest and real, those are not small words. Most people spend their whole lives in proximity to things that are none of those three. Arthur passed his first full week managing the shop without me standing over him. He made one error in the accounts and caught it himself before close of day. My father ate breakfast at the table 3 mornings in a row. I'm not saying spring, but I'm not saying never. Wyatt read the letter in the barn while he was supposed to be checking the condition of the tack before winter set in properly. He read it twice, folded it, put it in his coat pocket, and finished checking the tack. He did not write back immediately. He let 3 days go by, which was unusual for him. He had gotten into the habit of writing within a day or two, almost as a discipline, because he had found that the longer he waited, the more he second-guessed what he wanted to say. But this time he needed the 3 days to think about what she had written, about the careful way she had separated familiar from golden, and what that distinction said about how she saw her own life. When he did write, he said, "I think you just described courage more accurately than most people I've ever known." She wrote back, "Or stubbornness. We've established I have plenty of that." He almost laughed. He caught himself, alone in his kitchen, and shook his head. Bon pat. Winter came in hard that year, the second hard winter in a row, and Wyatt settled into it with the practiced resignation of a man who has stopped being surprised by the plains weather and started simply accounting for it. He laid in extra wood. He reinforced the barn against drafts. He checked the root cellar stock and calculated what would last and what wouldn't. He did the things that needed doing, and he did not think too much about spring or Philadelphia or the date on a train ticket that hadn't been purchased yet. He thought about those things anyway, of course. Late at night, when the wind was doing its work against the walls and the fire had burned down to coals, he would find his mind going east the way a compass needle goes north. Not by decision, but by pull. What he could not entirely account for, even to himself, was the certainty. Not confidence that everything would work out well. He was not built for that kind of easy faith, but a simpler, harder certainty that Vivian Mercer was real, that what had grown between them in 18 months of letters was real, and that the only way to find out what it amounted to in the actual world was to wait until she could come and then find out. That was all. It was not complicated. It was just difficult. He had stopped defending himself to his neighbors by this point. Sometime in the fall, he had made a quiet internal decision to simply stop engaging with the opinions, and he held to that decision through the winter with the same stubborn consistency he brought to fence mending and wood splitting. When Dolph Castle made a comment at the feed store in January, Wyatt nodded politely and changed the subject. When Mrs. Fenwick at the dry goods counter gave him the particular look she reserved for people she considered to be making avoidable mistakes, he bought his flour and said good morning and walked out. It was Tom Dempsey in February who pushed it further than politeness could contain. They had run into each other at the smithy in Caldwell, both there to have work done, both waiting in the cold shed that served as a waiting area. And Dempsey had apparently decided that the proximity and the boredom of waiting licensed a harder conversation than their October fence line talk. "There's a thing I've been meaning to say," Dempsey started, which was never a promising beginning. "Tom, hear me out." Dempsey was leaning forward, elbows on his knees, his hat in his hands. He had the expression of a man who has rehearsed something. "Margaret and I have been talking about this, and I know you don't want our opinions, but we're your neighbors, and that means we're going to give them anyway. You have spent 2 winters waiting on a woman in Philadelphia. 2 winters. You've turned down, I know of at least 2 women who would have been happy to. I know. And you're going to be 33 years old in April, and this land needs more than one pair of hands, and Tom." Dempsey stopped. Wyatt looked at him steadily. "I hear what you're saying. I know you mean it well. But I need you to understand something. I am not waiting because I can't find another option. I'm waiting because I've already made a decision, and I don't unmake decisions because they're inconvenient." He paused. "She is coming. I don't know when, but she's coming, and when she does, I expect you and Margaret to be decent to her." Dempsey blinked. He hadn't expected the last part. He sat back slightly. "Well, of course we'd be good. Then we understand each other." The smithy was quiet for a moment except for the sound of hammering from the back room. "You're the most stubborn man I have ever known," Dempsey said, and there was something in his voice that was almost, not quite, admiring. "I've been told," Wyatt said. March arrived and the cold began to loosen its grip, not graciously but grudgingly, the way it always did on the plains. The ground thawed by degrees. The first pale grass started coming up in the south-facing hollows where the sun hit longest. Wyatt began the spring work, ground preparation, equipment checks. The particular sequence of tasks that a farmer begins before the season actually starts because starting too late is a kind of failure he didn't permit himself. And in the second week of March, a letter came that was different from all the others. He could tell immediately. The envelope was thicker, heavier. Her handwriting on the outside looked slightly different, more deliberate, like she had been careful about something. He opened it at the kitchen table, still in his coat, having just come in from the barn. "Wyatt, Arthur has been managing the shop alone for 6 weeks. There have been 3 problems. He solved 2 of them correctly, and the third one he came to me about, which is the right instinct. Knowing when you're in over your head is a skill, not a weakness. My father has reviewed the accounts twice now and says the books are sound. He doesn't say things like that lightly. I had the conversation with my father that I have been putting off for months. I told him I had a train ticket to purchase and a life to go find out about. He said, 'It's about time.' Those were his exact words. It's about time. I don't know whether to be relieved or slightly irritated that he didn't put up more of a fight. The earliest I can be ready is the last week of April. The train from Philadelphia to Kansas City runs on Tuesdays and Fridays. I'm looking at the Friday departure the 25th of April. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what I intend to do. If there's a reason it shouldn't be that date, write to me immediately. If there isn't, I'll see you in early May. Vivian." He sat at the table without moving for probably 3 full minutes. The kitchen was cold. He hadn't stoked the fire yet. And outside the window, the March wind was doing its usual indifferent work across the empty prairie. He read the letter a second time. Then he got up, built the fire, put water on for coffee, and sat back down at the table with a piece of paper. He wrote, "No reason it shouldn't be that date. I'll be at the Caldwell station." He stared at those 2 sentences for a moment. Then he added, "The chair is still there. It always was." He sealed it and set it by the door to mail in the morning, and then he sat by the fire while the water heated and looked at nothing in particular for a long time. He did not tell anyone immediately. He held it for a week, going about his work, and the knowledge sat inside him like something with weight to it. Not quite comfortable, not quite uncomfortable, just present. Real in a way that the letters had always been real, but different, because now there was a date attached to it. He told Marta Castle first. Not Dolph. Marta. He rode over on a Sunday afternoon and found her in the kitchen and said simply, "She's coming in May. I thought you should know." Marta looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I'll make sure there's food in the house the week before she arrives." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to." She turned back to whatever she was working on. "Come back in April and I'll tell you what to stock." He said thank you, and she waved it off with one hand without turning around. He told Dempsey the following week at the feed store. Dempsey stood there for a second with the expression of a man who has been proven wrong about something and is deciding how to handle it. Then he stuck out his hand. "Well, all right then." Wyatt shook it. "Margaret will want to meet her," Dempsey added. "I figured." He told Pruitt at this commercial because Pruitt had been handling their correspondence for over a year and seemed to feel a proprietary interest in how the story came out. Pruitt leaned back in his chair and said, "Huh, I'll be damned," which was about as close to a sentimental response as Pruitt was capable of. He did not tell Mrs. Fenwick, but he understood she would know within 48 hours of him telling anyone, so he considered it covered. April was the longest month he had ever lived through. He had work to do. There was always work. The spring planting, the fence inspection after winter, a section of the barn floor that needed relaying. And he did the work, but the days had a stretched quality to them that he couldn't will away. He slept poorly. Not anxiously. He was not an anxious man by disposition. But his mind had a way of running at night that it didn't during daylight, turning over things he couldn't do anything about at 2 a.m. What was she like in person? Not what she was like in letters. He knew that version of her as well as he'd ever known anyone. But the actual texture of her, the sound of her voice, the way she moved through a room, whether the things he had come to think of as central to her, the directness, the unsentimental humor, the way she said difficult things without making them dramatic, whether those were the same in the flesh or whether they were a version that only existed on paper. He thought about what she had written months ago. "I'm afraid that the person you've been writing to and the person who will step off that train are not the same person." He had the same fear. He had just never said it quite that plainly. On the 20th of April, a final letter arrived from Philadelphia. "I leave Friday. By the time you read this, I will already be on the train or close to it. I'm not nervous." That's a lie. I'm quite nervous. But it's the kind of nervous that comes from doing something real rather than the kind that comes from making a mistake. I know the difference. I packed 2 trunks, which is more than I expected and less than my father thought I'd need. I've been trying to think clearly about what I'm walking toward, and I keep getting stuck on something you wrote in your very first letter. Tell me something true. I've been trying to tell you true things for a year and a half. I think that's more than most people manage in a lifetime of conversation. I'll see you soon. Vivian. He read it standing at the general delivery window, and Pruitt was watching him with undisguised curiosity from behind the counter, and Wyatt didn't much care. He drove the wagon into Caldwell on the morning of May 3rd, which was when the train from Kansas City was scheduled to arrive, or rather, when it was supposed to have arrived on the 2nd, delayed a day by a problem on the Missouri-Kansas line that Wyatt had learned about from the station master the previous afternoon. He had made the 14-mile trip twice now, the day before and today, and the second trip had a different quality to it. He left the ranch before first light, not because he needed to, the train wasn't until mid-morning, but because lying in the dark was worse than moving. The spring morning was cold and clear, the kind of clear that only happened on the plains when the air had been scrubbed clean by a night wind. The sky went from black to dark blue to the thin pale color it got just before the sun came up, and Wyatt drove the wagon south toward Caldwell, watching the light change over the grass and trying not to rehearse anything. He had a habit, when he was nervous, of rehearsing conversations in advance, working out what he'd say, which he'd learned was completely useless because real conversations never followed the rehearsed version. He got to town an hour before the train was due and tied the wagon at the rail outside the station and went inside to wait. The Caldwell station was a modest building, a single waiting room with wooden benches, a ticket window, a stove in the corner that was still burning against the morning chill. 2 other people were waiting, an older man in a worn coat and a young woman with a baby who was making the small preliminary sounds of deciding whether to cry. The station master, a thin man named Cooley, who had worked this station for 11 years and had the temporal patience of someone who had watched a great many trains come and go, glanced at Wyatt and nodded. Wyatt sat on a bench and waited. The young woman's baby made its decision and started crying, and she walked it back and forth at the far end of the room in that automatic, slightly desperate way of mothers everywhere. And the old man fell asleep against the wall with his hat over his face, and the stove ticked. Wyatt looked at the floor. He thought about the advertisement he had written in October of 1879, sitting at his kitchen table with a pencil stub and a piece of paper and a specific ache he hadn't known what to do with. Tell me something true. He had not known, when he wrote that, whether anyone would answer or whether whoever answered would be worth knowing. He had just known what he was asking for. He heard the train before he saw it, the low, sustained sound of it coming from the northeast, growing steadily more present. He got up from the bench and walked out onto the platform. The morning had warmed slightly. The sky was a clean, uncomplicated blue. The platform was empty except for him and Cooley, who came out with his clipboard and stood at the far end. The train came in with a great deal of noise and steam and gradual deceleration, the way trains did, and slid to a stop with a final lurch and hiss. The doors opened. A family got off first, a man with 2 small children and a great deal of luggage who immediately began arguing with each other about whose job it was to carry what. Then the old man from the waiting room shuffled out past Wyatt and toward the steps. Then a drummer in a city suit who looked around Caldwell with the resigned expression of someone who had been told this was a promising territory. Then she stepped off the train. He knew it was her before she reached the platform, not because he had any particular picture of her in his mind, because he had been careful not to build too specific a picture, but because of the way she looked at the town and then at the platform, and then found him standing there and didn't look away. She was not beautiful in any exceptional way, exactly as she had told him in her first letter. She was medium height, brown-haired, with a face that was specific rather than pretty, a strong jaw, a direct gaze, 2 years of hard work and harder decisions showing in the set of her shoulders. She was carrying a bag in one hand and looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, which meant it was probably the same expression he was wearing. She walked toward him. He walked toward her. They stopped about 3 feet apart. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Wyatt Granger," she said. Her voice was lower than he had imagined, and steadier. "Vivian Mercer," he said. She looked at him for a second. "You're taller than I pictured. You're—" He stopped. "Go on." "Exactly like I pictured," he said. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile exactly. Something underneath a smile. That's either a very good sign or a very strange thing to say to someone you've never met. "Probably both," he said. She looked at him for another moment, then she glanced past him at the wagon, at the horse standing patient at the rail, at the flat tan and green stretch of Kansas prairie beginning just past the edge of town. "Well," she said, and picked up her bag. "Show me what we've been writing to each other about." He took the bag from her. She didn't fight him for it, which he noted, and they walked toward the wagon together, and the morning stayed clear and cold and honest around them, and the grass moved in the wind the way it always had and always would, indifferent and endless and real. The ride out from Caldwell took just under an hour. They didn't talk much for the first part of it. That surprised him a little. He had half expected that seeing each other in person after all those letters would open something up immediately, like a valve releasing pressure. Instead, there was a quiet between them that was not uncomfortable, but was careful. Like 2 people who know a great deal about each other on paper and are now taking the time to find out whether the paper holds. Vivian sat on the wagon bench with her hands folded in her lap, watching the land. He watched her watching it from the corner of his eye. The prairie in early May was about as close to handsome as it ever got. The grass coming in green, the sky a serious blue, wildflowers scattered through the draws in yellows and pale purples. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of landscape that announced itself. But there was something in the scale of it, the flatness running out to every horizon, that had a particular effect on people seeing it for the first time. Some found it oppressive. Some found it peaceful. He had always found it honest. "It's bigger than I imagined," Vivian said, about 4 miles out of town. "It gets bigger," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" "Just accurate." She made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "You're exactly like your letters. Is that good or bad?" "It's good," she said. "I was afraid you might have been performing in the letters, showing me the best version." "I was," he said. "Somewhat." She looked at him. "And the rest?" "You'll find out." She held his gaze for a second, then turned back to the prairie. "Fair enough." When the ranch came into view, the house first, then the barn behind it, then the smaller structures, she sat up slightly, and he noticed. He didn't say anything. He let her look. It was not an impressive sight by any objective measure. The house was frame construction, decent-sized for one man, with a porch facing south that he had built with some care. The barn was solid and practical. The fences ran in straight lines to the east and west. The whole thing sat on the open grass without any trees of consequence nearby, exposed to the sky from every direction. He pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and set the brake. She sat there for a moment without getting down, looking at the porch. He saw her see the chairs, both of them, still there, side by side, exactly where he had put them. She was quiet for long enough that he started to wonder what was happening inside her head. Then she climbed down from the wagon without waiting for his help. He had already started to figure out that she was not a woman who waited for help she didn't need, and walked up the 2 steps onto the porch and stood in front of the chairs and looked at them. He came up behind her and stopped. "You actually left it there," she said. Her voice had something in it he couldn't name. "I said I would. Through 2 winters. Yep." She put her hand on the back of the empty chair. Not sitting in it, just touching it. He watched her do that and said nothing. "All right," she said after a moment. It was not a dramatic word. It was the word of someone who has just confirmed something they needed to confirm. She took her hand off the chair and turned around and looked at the house. "Show me inside." She was practical about everything, which he had expected, and her practicality was a relief after 18 months of anticipating it. She walked through the house the way a person does when they are genuinely assessing something, rather than politely admiring it. Opening the kitchen cupboards, checking the depth of the dry sink, looking at the floor joints, pressing her hand against the plaster of the interior walls to test for damp. She asked direct questions. How deep was the well? What kind of winters did the root cellar handle? Was there ever water in the basement after heavy rain? He answered everything honestly, including the things that were not ideal. The east wall of the spare bedroom had a draft in heavy winds that he hadn't fully solved. The root cellar was good, but the door needed a better seal before next winter. The well was 32 feet and had never gone dry, but the summer of 1877 had been close. She took this information in without visible distress. He appreciated that. What he had not anticipated was her eye for systems. Within the first afternoon, she had spotted 3 things about how he had organized the kitchen that were inefficient, pointed them out without any particular drama, and proposed specific adjustments. He stood in the kitchen doorway while she explained the logic of it, and felt the strange sensation of someone else thinking about his house as a place they were going to live. "You can tell me if I'm overstepping," she said mid-explanation, and glanced at him. "You're not," he said. "You hesitated." "I was just getting used to it, someone thinking about it the way you are." She looked at him for a moment. "How long have you lived here alone?" 6 years. 6 years of doing things your way. "More or less?" She nodded, not unkindly. "That's going to take some adjustment, for both of us." "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to reorganize everything you've built." "I know that too." She held his gaze. "Do you? Because some men say they know it and then find out they didn't. I'm not most men. I think I've mentioned that. Something that was definitely a smile this time. "You have. I'm verifying it." The Castles came over on the 3rd day. He had told Marta they were coming, and Marta arrived with Dolph mid-morning carrying a covered pot of something that smelled like beef and onions, and the particular expression of a woman who has decided to make a judgment and is keeping it professionally neutral until she has enough information. The introduction was brief and slightly awkward in the way introductions between strangers always were, but Marta was a practical woman, and Vivian was a practical woman, and within 20 minutes they had moved from polite small talk to a real conversation about the root cellar situation and what had and hadn't worked for preserving things through the previous 2 winters. Dolph stood with Wyatt near the barn and watched the 2 women talk on the porch. "Well," Dolph said. "Well, what?" Wyatt said. "She's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Dolph considered this. "Someone softer, maybe. Someone who looked like they'd have trouble." "She's not soft." "No," Dolph said, with a note of something that might have been respect. "She's not." They were quiet for a moment, watching. Vivian was saying something to Marta, pointing toward the south end of the property, gesturing with her hands in a way that suggested she was describing something she had already been thinking about. "She'll do all right," Dolph said. It was about as high a compliment as Dolph gave, and Wyatt accepted it at that value. So, they married 3 weeks after she arrived. It was not a large ceremony. The circuit preacher came through Caldwell in late May, and they arranged for it at the church, with the Castles and the Dempseys and a handful of other neighbors in attendance. Vivian wore a dark blue dress she had brought from Philadelphia, practical, well-made, nothing that would be ruined by a Kansas wind on the walk from the wagon to the church door. Wyatt wore his good coat, which he had brushed carefully the night before. The ceremony was short, The preacher was a decent man who kept things to what mattered. Wyatt said his words clearly and meant them. Vivian said hers the same way, looking at him directly, not at the preacher or the small gathering of people, at him. Afterward, outside, Margaret Dempsey cried quietly into a handkerchief, which she had apparently expected of herself because she had brought one. Marta Castle shook Vivian's hand with both of hers and said something in a low voice that Wyatt didn't catch. Dolph slapped him on the shoulder with a force that suggested genuine feeling. They drove home in the late afternoon. The light was doing its best work over the prairie, the way it did sometimes in May, the sky gone orange and gold at the edges. "How do you feel?" Vivian asked, about halfway home. He thought about it. "Like something I built is finally finished." She was quiet for a second. "That is either the most practical or the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "Can it be both?" She looked at the horizon. "I'm starting to think that's your whole philosophy." He couldn't argue with that. What happened in the months that followed was not a smooth adjustment. He had known it wouldn't be, and she had known it wouldn't be, and being right about that did not make it easier. They had 2 serious arguments in the first month. Not shouting arguments. Wyatt's anger ran cold and silent, which she found more difficult than shouting would have been, and she told him so directly, which he found useful even though it was uncomfortable to hear. Her stubbornness, which he had known about from her letters, but had perhaps underestimated in terms of its daily texture, showed up most clearly when she believed she was right about something, and he believed the opposite. She did not back down to keep the peace. He did not either. They learned, through a process that was occasionally genuinely unpleasant, how to disagree without it becoming something that needed to be repaired afterward. The second argument, in June, was about the ranch's accounts. She had gone through his records, with his knowledge and his permission, because she had asked, and he had said yes, and had found what she considered to be 3 significant inefficiencies in how he was managing his crop sales. He was selling his wheat through a middleman in Caldwell who was taking a margin that she calculated cost him nearly 12% of his net receipts every year. 12%, she said, at the kitchen table, with the ledger open between them. Every year. Do you understand what 12% compounds to over 10 years? "I've been using Hadley for 4 years, Wyatt said. "I know, that's why I'm saying something. Hadley's reliable. In a bad year, reliable is worth something. In a good year, 12% is also worth something." He looked at the numbers. She had laid them out clearly. She had a typesetter's precision with columns and figures. The numbers were correct. He knew they were correct. What he was resistant to was not the math. "This is my operation," he said, and heard immediately how it sounded. She heard it too. She put her pencil down carefully. "I know it is. I'm not saying you just said my operation." He stopped. She looked at him without heat, which was in some ways worse than anger. "I'm not trying to take your operation from you, Wyatt. I'm trying to make it better. That's what I came here to do. That's what we talked about in letters for a year and a half. Partner. Remember?" He looked at the ledger. He looked at the numbers. He thought about the word he had put in that advertisement in October of 1879, the word that had made her write to him in the first place. "I'll talk to Hadley," he said. "You don't have to do it my way." "No, you're right. I'll talk to him." She held his gaze for a moment. Something settled between them. Not comfort exactly, but a kind of mutual recognition that this was what it was going to be, working things out at a kitchen table, neither of them perfect, both of them trying. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me when I'm being stubborn about it." "I'm thanking you for stopping being stubborn about it. That's different." By the second summer, she had changed 3 things about how the ranch operated, all of them improvements that he would not have arrived at on his own. She renegotiated the wheat contract as promised, and the 12% margin became 4. She established a direct relationship with a dry goods merchant in Wichita that cut their supply costs for certain staples. And she started keeping a second set of accounts, a forward-looking ledger, she called it, that tracked not just what they had spent and earned, but what they were likely to spend and earn, which gave them a way to make decisions about investment and risk that he had previously been making mostly by instinct. He had been making those decisions by instinct for 6 years, and he had survived. With the ledger, they began to do more than survive. He learned things too, though his version of learning was less systematic and more stubborn. He learned that she needed quiet in the mornings before she was ready to talk, which ran contrary to his habit of addressing whatever was on his mind as soon as it occurred to him. He learned that when she went silent for more than a day, it was not unhappiness, but processing. She was working something out internally and didn't want to discuss it until she had gotten somewhere, and that asking her what was the wrong question. He learned that she found the prairie loneliness genuinely difficult in the first year, not in the way he had feared, not in the way that made people leave, but in a real way that she didn't always have words for and that he couldn't fix. What he could do was be present. He learned to do that better. There was an evening in the first autumn, after a day that had been neither difficult nor easy, but simply long in the way farm days were long, when they sat on the porch in the two chairs and watched the light go out of the sky. She had a cup of coffee going cold in her hand. He was just sitting. The prairie was doing its quiet evening thing. The grass settling, a few birds making their last passes, the temperature dropping in that gradual way it did in September. "I wrote to my father today," she said. "How is he?" "Better. Arthur apparently reorganized the filing system." A pause. "In a way my father hates." Wyatt almost smiled. "What did he do?" "Complained to me about it in great detail, which means he's well enough to have opinions about filing systems. I consider that a recovery." He looked at the sky. The first stars were coming up in the east. "Do you miss it?" "Philadelphia." She was quiet for a moment. He had learned to let her be quiet. "I miss my father," she said. "I miss being good at something I already knew how to do. I miss—" She stopped. "There are things I miss. But missing something doesn't mean you should have stayed." "No," he said. She looked at the prairie. "This is bigger than it was in my head, even after all those letters. I don't think words actually get it right." "No," he agreed. "They don't." "You knew that and you still tried." Seemed worth trying. She looked at him with that specific expression she had, the one that was almost a smile, but more than a smile, the one that had something behind it she didn't always say. "It was," she said. "Well, the summer of 1883 was when the drought came. Not the worst drought the plains had ever seen, but bad enough. 8 weeks with no rain of consequence, the grass going from green to brown to the color of old straw, the creek to the north of the property dropping to a thin, dark line in its bed. The wheat came in at roughly half what they had projected. The kitchen garden that Vivian had established by the east wall of the house gave up by July. They did not panic. They had the forward-looking ledger, and it told them they could sustain 2 bad years before they were in genuine trouble. They cut where they could. They made decisions carefully and without drama. In August, when it became clear that 3 of the neighboring families were worse off than they were, the Purcell claim to the south had lost nearly everything, Vivian brought it up at the kitchen table. "We have enough," she said. "Enough for us," he said. "More than enough for us. The Purcells have 2 children." He looked at the ledger. He knew what she was suggesting, and he was not opposed to it. He was thinking about how to do it without making the Purcells feel the weight of it. "We don't give them money," he said. "No," she agreed. "We have them over for supper, and there happen to be extra provisions when they leave. And if he pushes back, then you tell him it's what neighbors do, and you say it like you mean it, and he'll accept it because he needs to." Wyatt looked at her. She was right, and she knew she was right, and she was not particularly triumphant about it. That was one of the things he had come to rely on in her. She was right about things without requiring you to acknowledge it extensively. "All right," he said. They had the Purcells over that Sunday. They sent them home with 2 bushels of provisions and the assurance, delivered in Wyatt's flat, unornamental way, that it was what neighbors did. Frank Purcell accepted it with the dignity of a man who has swallowed his pride for his children's sake, which was the only kind of dignity that mattered. The library was Vivian's idea, and it started small. She had brought 2 trunks from Philadelphia, and one of them had been nearly half full of books. She had been reading since she arrived. Evenings on the porch, Sunday afternoons, the quiet hours of winter, and had started lending them to Marta Castle, who had given them to her daughters, who had passed them to the Dempsey children. By the 3rd year, there was an informal circuit of books moving through the neighboring homesteads, and Vivian had written to a book distributor in Kansas City and arranged a modest standing order for new volumes. "We can't afford a building," Wyatt said, when she first described the fuller version of what she had in mind. "We don't need a building. We need a room." "What room?" "The spare bedroom, the one you were using for storage." He thought about the spare bedroom. He thought about how she had reorganized the storage into the root cellar and the barn over the past year, clearing the room incrementally, which he now understood had been intentional. "How long have you been planning this?" he asked. She looked at him with perfect composure. A while. You might have mentioned it. I wanted to be sure it was possible before I brought it up. I don't like proposing things I can't deliver. He stood in the doorway of the spare bedroom and looked at the empty space. Afternoon light came through the east window, the same light he had noticed the day she arrived, the decent light that landed well on the floor. Shelves along that wall, she said, from behind him. A table in the center, 2 chairs. Families can come on Saturday mornings. Families coming here on Saturday mornings, he said. Is that a problem? He turned around. No, I'm just adjusting. You do a lot of that. You give me a lot to adjust to. She held his gaze, and this time the almost smile was fully a smile, without the something behind it quality, just plain and real. I know, she said. I consider that a feature. He shook his head and looked back at the room and started calculating, without meaning to, how many shelves the wall could hold. By 1885, the room held 412 books. Vivian kept a list. Families came on Saturday mornings the way she had said they would, at first tentatively, then regularly, then with the particular sense of expectation that meant it had become something people counted on. Children sat at the center table and read things they had no other way of accessing. Mothers borrowed novels and returned them with opinions. The Dempsey boy, who was 11 and had a sharp, restless mind that didn't have much to work on out on the prairie, worked through 6 books in one winter and wrote Vivian a letter asking if there was any way to get more about engineering, because he had read everything she had on the subject. She wrote back to Kansas City and ordered 4. Wyatt, who had not grown up as a reader and had not become one in any serious way, even after 400 books lived in his spare bedroom, watched all of this from a slight distance and understood, more clearly than he could have articulated, that what Vivian had built in that room was something the land could not provide on its own, something that reached past the flat horizon and brought the wider world in. He understood also that this had been in her from the start, this need to connect things, to create systems that served people, and that it was not separate from why she had answered his advertisement, but continuous with it. He told her that one evening on the porch, in his inexact, groping way. He was not good at these observations out loud. She listened to him stumble through it and didn't help him find the words, which he appreciated because it would have felt patronizing if she had. You're saying the library is the same thing as the letters, she said, when he'd gotten it out. Something like that. Connecting things that couldn't connect on their own. Yeah. She looked at the prairie. The sun was getting low. Somewhere behind the barn, a meadowlark was making its 4-note declaration, the same sound the prairie had been making since before either of them was born. I think you're right, she said. They sat in the 2 chairs while the light went out of the day and the stars came up one by one in the east, and the grass moved in its quiet way, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it. The years did not pass gently. They passed the way prairie years always did, with weight, with weather, with the particular accumulation of small losses and small victories that eventually added up to a life. Edmund Mercer died in the winter of 1887, 6 years after his stroke, in the bedroom above his typesetting shop in Philadelphia with Arthur sitting in the hall and a letter from Vivian on the nightstand that had arrived 3 days before he lost the ability to read. Vivian got the telegram on a Tuesday morning in February, standing in the kitchen with her coat still on from checking on the animals. She read it once, set it on the table, and stood at the window for a long time looking at the snow that had come in overnight and covered the prairie in white. Wyatt came in from the barn 20 minutes later and found her standing there. He read the telegram without her having to say anything. He came and stood beside her at the window. He didn't put his arm around her or say that he was sorry or any of the things people said. He just stood there with her and looked at the snow. After a while, she said, "He knew I was happy here." "Yes," Wyatt said. "I made sure he knew that. Before, I made sure." "I know you did." She was quiet for another long moment. He said, the last time I wrote, that the advertisement was the best thing I ever answered. Her voice was steady, but had something working underneath it. He said he was glad I had better sense than he gave me credit for. Wyatt said nothing. There was nothing to add to that. She turned away from the window eventually and went about the day's work, because that was what you did. Because the animals needed feeding, and the stove needed wood, and life on the plains did not pause for grief. But he watched her that day with a particular attention, not hovering, just present, and that evening on the porch, too cold for the porch, really, both of them in heavy coats. She sat in her chair, and he sat in his, and she finally let the quiet crack a little. Not dramatically, just enough. I keep thinking about the last letter I sent him, she said. Whether I said enough. You wrote him every month for 6 years. That's not what I mean. He knew what she meant. You can't ever say enough, he said. Nobody can. That's not a failure. That's just what it is. She looked at the dark prairie. That's very practical. It's true. Yes, she said. It is. She pulled her coat tighter. Thank you for not telling me it's all right. It's not all right, he said. It's just survivable. She reached over without looking at him and put her hand on his arm and left it there for a while. He didn't move. The cold settled around them and the stars were very clear overhead and the grass whispered in the wind the way it always had. Their children came in the years between. The first, a boy they named Edmund after her father, was born in 1883. Difficult labor. A long night. Marta Castle there because Marta had decided years ago that she was going to be useful at this ranch, whether anyone asked her to be or not. He was a serious child who had his mother's precision and his father's jaw, and who by the age of 7 was reading everything in the library room with an appetite that delighted Vivian and mildly astonished Wyatt, who had never been a reader and found it slightly mysterious that a child of his had become one. The second, a girl named Clara, arrived in 1886, and was the opposite of her brother in nearly every way. Loud, physical, happiest outside. With a quality of pure forward momentum that Vivian recognized and Wyatt found both exhausting and deeply familiar. Clara was the child who wanted to know how the windmill worked, not by reading about it, but by taking it apart, which she did at age 9, and which resulted in a long afternoon of Wyatt and his daughter putting it back together with Vivian, watching from the yard with an expression of carefully controlled amusement. She gets that from you, Vivian said that evening. She got the recklessness from somewhere else, Wyatt replied. Vivian did not argue the point. There was a third pregnancy in 1889 that did not reach term. They did not talk about it extensively, not from avoidance, but because some things live below the level of words, and both of them understood that. What he remembered from that time was that she was very quiet for about 2 months afterward, and that he stayed close without making it obvious, and that one night she said, "I'm all right." Not as a performance, but as an actual report, and he believed her, and they moved forward. They were not a demonstrative couple by the standards of people who needed to see feeling performed. What they had was practical and specific and deeply held, and it showed in the texture of ordinary days rather than in declarations. He brought her coffee in the morning before she asked for it because he had learned how she took it and when she needed it. She noticed when his shoulder was bothering him, an old injury from a fence post accident in 1880 that occasionally came back, and said nothing about it but adjusted what she asked him to carry without making it a thing. These were small acts that accumulated over years into something that had more structural integrity than most declarations ever achieved. Edmund grew up and went east to study engineering, which surprised no one who had watched him work through the library. He wrote long letters home. He had inherited his parents' correspondence habits, and came back for harvests when he could. Clara stayed in her fashion. She married the Purcell boy, the same one who had come over with his parents during the drought year of 1883, and they worked a claim 3 miles to the south that Wyatt had helped them establish. She came by often. She had her father's quality of getting things done without unnecessary commentary, which served her well and occasionally made her husband feel slightly outmatched, which Vivian told her, gently and directly, was something she needed to manage with a little more patience. "You sound like me in 1882, Vivian said, the time they had that conversation. Clara looked at her. "What happened in 1882? "Your father and I had an argument about the wheat contract that was my fault in a way I didn't want to admit." "You admitted it?" "Eventually. It took longer than it should have." She looked at her daughter steadily. "James is a good man. Being right all the time is less useful than you think it is." Clara was quiet. She had her father's quality of sitting with things rather than immediately responding, which was one of the ways she was more like him than she appeared. "Did Pa tell you that? About the wheat contract?" "He never mentioned it after we resolved it. That's another thing worth learning." The library outlasted the spare bedroom. By 1892, there were over 800 books, and the room could no longer hold them decently, and Vivian had been managing the overflow with a system of rotating loans that worked but was showing strain. Wyatt built a small addition onto the east side of the house, 12 feet by 16, with good window light and shelves floor to ceiling. and they moved the library into it the following spring. On the first Saturday after the move, 14 families came. The Dempsey boy, now a grown man who had gone to work for a railroad engineering firm in Topeka, came back specifically for the occasion and shook Vivian's hand and told her that what she had built had mattered more than she probably knew. "I know," she said, and he laughed, and she did too. Wyatt watched from the doorway of the new room with his arms crossed and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already obvious. The ranch by the mid-1890s was one of the more stable operations in Rook County. Not the largest, not the most prosperous in absolute terms, but solid in a way that other homesteads often weren't. The kind of solid that came from careful decisions made consistently over a long time, from a forward-looking ledger kept faithfully, from knowing the land well enough to work with it rather than against it. They had survived 2 droughts and a crop failure and the brutal economic contraction of 1893 that had broken dozens of farms in the county. They had come through each of these not without cost but without catastrophe, which on the Kansas prairie in the late 19th century was its own kind of achievement. Wyatt's hair went gray in his 50s, and he let it, not particularly interested in the appearance of being younger than he was. His hands were a catalog of old injuries, a scar across the left palm from a saw in 1884, the crooked set of 2 fingers on the right hand from a break that had healed imperfectly, the permanent roughness of skin that had been working outdoors for 30 years. He moved more carefully than he had in his 30s, not stiffly, but deliberately, the way a man moves when he has learned that carelessness costs. Vivian's hair went gray too, and she wore it the same practical way she always had. She kept the accounts. She kept the library. She wrote letters. To Edmund in the East, to her father's old associates in Philadelphia, to the book distributor in Kansas City, to Clara 3 miles south. She had never stopped writing letters, and she was better at it than she had been at 27, which was saying something. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, when weather permitted. The chairs were not the original chairs. Those had worn out years ago, but they were the same chairs in the way that mattered, occupying the same positions, facing the same direction. It had become so habitual that on evenings when one of them was inside and the other came out and sat, the empty chair had a specific quality to it, not sad, just incomplete, the way a sentence is incomplete before the period. Wyatt died in the spring of 1901. He had been slowing for 2 years, not from any single dramatic thing, but from the accumulation of decades, the way strong things slow. He worked less. He sat more. He watched the land with the focused, almost professional attention of someone who is looking at something they know they will not always be able to look at. He was not morbid about it. He was not, as far as Vivian could tell, afraid of it. He was simply finishing. Clara and her family were at the ranch for the last weeks. Edmund came from the east when the letters made clear it was time, arriving on a Tuesday with the travel-worn look of a man who had pushed the journey as fast as the trains would allow. He sat with his father for long hours, and they talked about things Vivian wasn't present for, and she didn't ask about afterward because she understood that a man and his son needed their own accounting. Wyatt died on a Thursday morning in April, early, before the sun was fully up. Vivian was there. Clara was there. It was quiet, and it was not dramatic, and he was not in distress, which was the only thing she had asked for, internally, in the weeks beforehand. That it not hurt him badly. It didn't. Edmund, in the kitchen afterward, while the house filled with the particular silence of that kind of morning, put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a long time. He was 42 years old and looked very much like his father in that moment. Was he happy? He asked. Not a child's question, an engineer's question, wanting the actual honest answer. Vivian was at the stove because she needed something to do with her hands. He was a man who built things, she said. He was happiest when he was building something or when something he'd built was working. She was quiet for a moment. This was his life's work, the land, you and Clara, the library, all of it. So yes, he was happy. Not in a simple way, but yes. Edmund nodded. He was also difficult, she said, and stubborn, and his version of expressing affection was making sure the woodbox was never empty, and he had a temper that ran cold in a way that was harder to deal with than shouting. She paused. I need you to know all of it, not just the good parts. Edmund looked at her. He had her eyes. I know all of it, Ma. Good, she said, and went back to the coffee. She found the draft 3 weeks later. She was going through the papers in the roll-top desk in the corner of the bedroom. The desk that had been his, that she had barely opened in 20 years of marriage because it was his space, and she had respected that without it ever being a rule, just an understanding. There were the expected things: land documents, correspondence with the county, letters from Edmund over the years, the original claim paperwork from 1875. And at the back of the bottom drawer, folded 4 times and worn at the creases from having been folded and unfolded many times, was a piece of paper she recognized. She knew what it was before she opened it: the weight of it, the age of the paper, the specific size. She had seen enough newspaper advertisement copy in her years working at the printing press to know what she was holding. She unfolded it at the desk, in the morning light that came through the bedroom window, and fell across the wooden surface the same way it had for 20 years. It was the original handwritten draft of the advertisement. His handwriting, the same she had been reading for decades. Direct, slightly cramped, entirely functional. She read the familiar lines. Not looking for a housekeeper or a decoration. Looking for a partner. The line about the second chair. She had read these words 22 years ago standing at a printing press in Philadelphia, and they landed differently now in the way that words do when you have lived inside them long enough to know their full weight. But below the last line of the original text, in ink that was slightly darker, added later, clearly added later, because the paper had been folded at that point and the line was written on the fold, were 7 words she had never seen. She came. She sat in it. I was right. She sat at the desk and looked at those 7 words for a long time. She could not have said exactly when he wrote them. After she arrived, certainly. After she sat in that chair on the first day, she thought about him taking this draft out of the drawer at some point, maybe that first week, maybe later, and adding that line and folding it back up and putting it away and never mentioning it, never using it as a thing to say, just writing it down for himself in the private way he did things, because it was true and he had needed to record it somewhere. She pressed her hand flat against the paper. Outside the window, the prairie was doing what it always did in April, coming back to itself after winter, the grass returning in its patient, unstoppable way, the sky enormous and clear. Somewhere behind the barn, a meadowlark was working through its 4 notes, the same sound the land had been making since before either of them was born, the same sound it would be making long after. She thought about what she would tell Clara when she came over this afternoon. She thought about Edmund on the train back east, carrying his father's death with him in the compressed, practical way he carried difficult things. She thought about the Saturday families who would still come to the library next week, the children who would sit at the table and read things that reached past the flat horizon, the particular accumulation of that over years. She thought about a woman of 27 standing at a printing press in Philadelphia, reading an advertisement she had read twice already, reading it a 3rd time because of a single word. Partner. She thought about the courage it had taken to write back, and the courage it had taken to stay when her father got sick, and the courage it had taken to board the train after 1.5 years of letters, not knowing whether the person she had built in her mind would match the person who met her on the platform. He had matched. Not perfectly. She had learned a long time ago that perfectly was not the measure of anything worth measuring. He had matched in the ways that mattered. He had been difficult and stubborn and had expressed love through a full woodbox, and he had also been exactly, specifically, irreplaceably himself, which was the only thing she had ever asked anyone to be. She got up from the desk, still holding the paper. She walked through the house, through the kitchen where the coffee she had made that morning was still faintly warm on the stove, through the hallway past the children's old rooms, through the library addition where 800 books sat in their practical rows waiting for the next Saturday morning. She walked out the front door and onto the porch. The 2 chairs were there. They were always there. She sat in hers. The empty chair beside her had the weight of absence in it, the particular fullness that empty things have when they have been occupied for a very long time by someone specific. She did not look at it directly. She looked at the prairie instead, the way they had always looked at it, south and west, the grass moving in long, slow waves under the April wind. The meadowlark was still at it behind the barn. 4 notes, pause, 4 notes. She had been afraid, 22 years ago, that the chair was a beautiful idea that wouldn't survive contact with reality. She understood now that she had been asking the wrong question. The question was never whether the idea would survive reality. The question was whether the reality you built would be worth the idea that started it. She held the folded paper in her lap, because what Wyatt had known from the beginning From the moment he dragged two chairs onto an unfinished porch and set one of them empty for a woman he had never met. What he had known, and she had slowly learned, and what the years had proved true in the only way things can be proved true, which is by living them, was this. You do not wait for certainty before you build something. You build it. You set the chair out in the weather. You write the letter. You tell the truth about what you are, and what you want, and what you're afraid of, and then you wait. Not passively, but actively, with both hands working, and you see what comes. Some things don't come. Some chairs stay empty. Some letters go unanswered. Some futures don't arrive. Some plans dissolve in the first hard winter and leave nothing behind. But some things do come. And when they do, you don't say the word lucky, because luck is what you call it when you can't see all the decisions that made it possible. You say, I built something and I waited and I was right to do both. She sat on the porch while the April morning moved through its paces around her, the light shifting, the grass doing its patient work, the sky going about the serious business of being the sky. She was 63 years old. She had gray hair and calloused hands and a mind that still kept accounts and still noticed inefficiencies and still reached for a pencil when something needed to be made precise. She was also, in the specific and unromantic and completely true sense of the word, exactly where she was supposed to be. After a while, she unfolded the paper one more time and read his 7 words. She came. She sat in it. I was right. She folded it back carefully along its old creases. She put it in her pocket, close against her chest, the same place he used to put her letters on the long rides home from Caldwell. Then she looked out at the prairie, and the prairie looked back, and the meadowlark set its 4 notes into the morning air, and Vivian Granger, who had been Vivian Mercer, who had stood at a printing press in Philadelphia and read an advertisement 3 times and written back a letter that began, I'm going to tell you something true, sat in her chair and watched the grass move and understood, in the way you only understand things after enough years, that the dream they had built together would outlive them both. It already had.